I was very naive when I bought a franchise, in that I was just thinking, oh, I can make $130,000, which 30 years ago was great money. And I'll just do these inventories every day.
Welcome to the Franchise Friend Podcast, where we bring you an exclusive look into the world of franchise ownership.
All right. Today I'm joined by Ian Foster out in California. He has over 30 years of franchising experience. So quite the veteran in our space. Is going to probably share a lot of knowledge with us. So Ian, I appreciate you jumping on with me today.
Thank you, Charles. Happy to be here.
Yeah, man. So originally a Canadian and moved down to California. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia. Right.
So did you move down here for a corporate job or?
No, I actually moved down here to buy my second franchise. So that's why I'm here.
Okay. So what franchise were you, did you start off with originally?
Well, actually, it's the same franchise, but I bought my second territory. I expanded.
Okay. So are you managing the first territory still in Canada?
I tried that for a while and didn't end so well. And so I ended up selling it to a really close friend. He's doing great. And I was happy to be able to help him and make it work. So
is this the Sculpture Hospitality franchise?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. Share with us a little bit about what Sculpture does and, for people who may not be familiar.
It's a kind of a unusual business in that we work for bar and restaurant owners, and we help them eliminate overpouring and theft and all the things that happen almost every day in a bar. I was really surprised when I first stumbled across this to find out that in the US, for example, the average bar is missing 20 to 30% of their inventory from mainly overpouring and drinks not getting rung up. The metrics they look at don't actually tell them that, which is, kind of shocking. I would say this: if you ran a car dealership and 1 out of every 5 cars went missing off the lot every day, you would know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I remember I had a bartending job in college, and they tried these little contraptions on top of the liquor bottles where you hold it and you try to, do 1 ounce shot, and that didn't last very long,
Now the guest going into a restaurant or a bar doesn't want to see a contraption on a bottle.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They want to feel like they're getting the deal, right? They want to see it. They want to see a little bit extra pour, don't they? Yeah. So you're dealing with a lot of business owners yourself, like you're helping restaurant owners and food owners, is it mostly bar, restaurant? Is that mostly who you're helping out?
Yeah. We do work with hotels sometimes or stadiums, but it's, I'd say probably 50 to 60% of our business is with classic bars, sports bars and that kind of thing. And then the other 30 to 40% is probably restaurants with a pretty healthy bar business attached to it. So.
Okay. So are people typically like, hey, like where are they at, I guess, in there? Like your service, something that they start with, or is there just so much pain down the road that they're just like, where am I losing my profits? And now,
actually, Charles, none of the above. We generally walking into a restaurant or a bar and introducing ourselves to the owner. Then what we try and do is get them to sit down with us for about 15 minutes so we can explain what we do and why and what we've seen in the industry. And all along, they're very skeptical. They don't think they're missing much.
Sure.
They all understand that there's some overpouring, but in their mind, it's like 5 or 6%. And so our approach is to say, look, why don't we come in? We'll do like a 3-week discovery period. We'll come in like 4 a.m. So nobody knows we're doing it. And at the end of that, you can look at the numbers. And if it makes financial sense to use our service, great. And if not, that's fine. In 30 years, I think I've seen 2 bars out of thousands that weren't missing 20%. If you can get the key to our business is if you can get a meeting with an owner, you're going to get a client. But getting a meeting with an owner is very, very difficult. They don't want to talk to salespeople, and they think that's what we are when we first walk in.
Yeah, right. What would you say restaurant owners, what are some of their biggest obstacles to overcome, like outside of overpouring, like where it kind of sounds like to me, like, they may be distracted, right? Like maybe trying to put out other fires, like what are you seeing now in the restaurant business?
It's a really, really difficult business that became a lot more difficult post-COVID. The restaurant economics prior to COVID were not very good. I think the National Restaurant Association's statistics are that the average one makes 5% profit margin,
wow,
which is obviously very low.
Sure.
And there's a lot making a lot more than that, 15 or 20%, maybe not 20, but that means there's an awful lot of restaurants where it's really a job for the owner. And since then, everything's got worse. Food costs have gone up. Labor costs have gone up. If they're using any of these delivery services, they're getting hammered on those commissions as well. It just is a very, very difficult business. So I understand why it's so hard for us to sit down with a restaurant or a bar owner and have them give us some time, because they've got a lot of other priorities, as you mentioned. And not only that, they're inundated with salespeople walking in, selling them one thing or another. So once we can break through all that clutter and get a meeting with them, in the long run, they can't believe how much more money they're making with our service. So we feel very, very good about what we do. It's sort of a win-win for everybody involved.
Yeah. So, to take a step back here, Ian's personal journey of why did you decide that franchising was going to be a good fit for you?
I had no intention of buying a franchise ever. It had never really even occurred to me. So I was living up in Canada at the time, and I kept getting moved and promoted with a big frozen foods company, $2 billion frozen foods company, to the point where I got a position in Toronto, which is where their head office was, as their national accounts manager at the age of 27. Great job, making lots of money, basically taking people out for lunch for a living. It was incredible. I was really happy with the company and the way I was treated. And one day I was really early for a meeting with Arby's, actually. And so I had an hour to kill. So I walked into a bar across the street that I used to call on when I was a regular sales rep. And it was about 8 a.m. And the owner, this young guy who I'm a really good friend with now, he says, come in, let me show you what I'm doing. And he's weighing these bottles on a scale. I'm like, George, what are you doing? And he says, oh, I hired this company to do these inventories for me. And they made me so much money, I bought a franchise. And sort of light bulbs went off for me. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty good story that a customer was making so much money that they decided to become to join that business. And so I looked into it, and the more I learned about the economics of it, especially, the more excited I got. And I thought, I'm 20 at that time. By then I was 28. I'm 28. I don't have a wife and kids. If I'm going to take a big risk in life, this is the time to do it.
Sure.
So I quit this great job and moved all the way back to Vancouver, moved into my parents' basement, bought the cheapest car I could find that actually went on fire one time when I was meeting with a client. And it was almost a crazy decision, except that I wouldn't have made it later in life. I wouldn't have made it when I was 50, for example, because, you've got mortgages and kids going, saving for college and those kinds of things. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, whenever I'm typically helping people, try to find a franchise, they are kind of stuck there, right? I got 2 kids, maybe they're going to college, maybe they're in private school, they're making good money. It's really hard for them to kind of, the way that they live their life has been raised, that bar has been raised, so they need the cash flow, and so it's really hard to transition out of that and leave that corporate job, and so it's really tough for a lot of people. So, it's either, I like to get people who are in their 20s, late 20s, they don't have anything to lose, so let's do it. But most of the people that I do help are, in their 50s, and they're wish I could have.
Well, it's interesting. The franchise I bought at the time was very undeveloped. They didn't have a system. They didn't really have any really understanding of even the basic economics of the business. It was a true startup. There was one other franchisee anywhere in the world, and that was the guy, George. So I was the second franchisee. And I think that's why I wouldn't have taken the risk at 50, because it was an unproven concept.
Sure.
And the exciting part for us is we got to, if we had a good idea and something that worked, all of a sudden everybody was doing it in the company, because there wasn't a true system set up. So we had to help the founder go through that process.
Yeah.
I wouldn't buy a franchise like that in my 50s, but in your 20s, it's fine. I would buy a proven franchise with a proven concept.
Sure. So 30 years ago, is that about right? And sculpture. Right. Yeah. And so, I guess talk a little bit more about that. Have you seen the evolution of once emerging franchise concept where everybody's kind of feeling around in the dark here, not sure what's going on and figuring it out as you go. How's that progressed over the past 30 years?
Yeah. Well, with a lot of pain at the beginning, to be honest. I remember, I looked at the founder of our company, a good guy, but not like a super entrepreneur. And he was doing pretty decently. So my thought process was, if he can do well, I'll kill it, because I had some sales experience. And
sure.
This is going to be easy. And I went out, and I remember I was prospecting 8-9 hours a day. And my pitch to restaurant owners and bar owners was, hey, I'll come in and do it for free for a month, and you can decide if it's worthwhile. And my birthday's in April, so I started just before Christmas. So 4 months in, I had one client. I was failing miserably. And I was thinking, I've made a huge mistake here. Am I going to have to go back to the corporate world and maybe work a weekend job to pay back my loan?
Yeah.
And I remember on my birthday looking in the mirror and saying, well, look, you still believe in the concept. Let's just do everything differently than what you're doing now, because what you're doing now doesn't work. Kind of like if you're a Seinfeld fan when George decided to be opposite George. And so, so I changed 3 or 4 things I was doing, and all of a sudden it started to click, and we started to get clients. And around the same time, we started having, with the 3 or 4 franchisees at the time, we started having regular conference calls to share ideas. That was really helpful. And I remember about 2 years later, we had our first convention, and sort of at the convention, the knowledge and I guess experience of by that time we had like a dozen or maybe even 20 franchisees worldwide, and just all those people together sharing ideas. Just, you came out of there so energized, so excited about new ideas, and really seeing a way to systematize your business. Because prior to that, you were just kind of winging it. So that was a huge turning point for all of us, I think, and the company as a whole. And since then, it's been, sort of a steady improvement in the way we do things. Technology's helped. When we did the inventories remember that multicolored Bic pen you had in the 3rd grade?
Yes, I do.
We used to kind of like that. Shelf 1 was red, shelf 2 was blue.
Yeah.
And the problem was you could only do small bars that way because you only had 4 colors, and you started drawing different columns. And so when the Palm Pilot came out, you can imagine how long ago that was. We switched to taking inventories on the Palm Pilot and scanning the bottle labels. That was another huge leap forward for us. We could all of a sudden do the inventories in, maybe half the time it used to take us. So, it's been a steady evolution, but with some ups and downs, like anything, I think.
So, are you a area developer as well? Is that right?
Yes, I am. Yeah. I wear 2 hats.
Okay. So you're bringing on new franchisees.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah. So, where do you feel as if people get hung up, not necessarily on the concept, but on taking that leap? Like, where do you feel like people are?
You mean to actually making a decision to get into it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing we see often is the person we talk to first is really excited, and their spouse talks them out of it, which I get. I get that. So that's one place they get hung up. Ours is a very low cost business to get into. So for us, it's not really the cost of buying a franchise. It's more the opportunity cost, right? If you buy a franchise, at least our franchise, you might go 6 months before you're making any decent money. Yeah. And if you had a job paying you up, let's say 120 grand a year, over the 6 months, you'd make 60 grand. So that's sort of the opportunity cost of it. And if it takes you longer, you start to get worried, right? Because, a lot of people don't have $100,000 sitting in the bank to get them through a year and a half.
Right.
So I think it's that and fear. Simply said, they don't know if they can succeed in the business. You can't, test it before you buy it, so to speak. You got to jump in.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. The fear of the unknown.
Right.
Yeah. So funny. I was, so many people that I've helped, and they're very reluctant to bring on their spouse during, the process, and, I'll tell her about it or I'll tell him about it, and then I'll just relay whatever we talk about today. And I'm like, it's going to come across as you are convincing them, not as,
Correct.
not as you're, informing them. It's going to sound like you're giving them a sales pitch, And so, so I've always encouraged people like, your wife has to be, or husband needs to be through this whole process with you, of this whole discovery of figuring out if this is something that you guys want to do. The whole house has to be on board, but
100%.
Yeah, I feel
it's
like
got to be a partnership, really, right? It's got to be viewed that way, that the other spouse might not be involved in the business, but they've got to think it's a good idea and be supportive. It's a huge factor, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like sometimes I have husbands like taking our calls in the closet, and they're just like, hiding from their wife, and that she has no idea that he's looking at businesses.
Such a male ego thing, right?
Right. Yeah. So was there, you kind of talked about that time at the beginning where you kind of felt like there was, you might fail, have you had any of those times along the way? Or has it kind of been smooth sailing? I mean, like there had to have been some type of arc here over the past, couple, 20 years or so. Like, has there been times where you're like, you know what, I can't do this anymore, or you feel like you're going to fail?
No. In fact, the opposite. That one thing that period of my life taught me was that, or at least made me feel like I could do anything. If I could get through that, which was brutal. I mean, it was really hard. That I could, at any obstacle, I'd be fine with. So when an opportunity came up to buy franchises in the United States, I decided to change countries and move to San Diego and start from scratch, so to speak. So I kind of felt a little fearless. But to your point, life isn't always as smooth as you think. So pretty much franchise wide, all our plans were upended by COVID. Yeah. When I looked at this business, I thought about what risks there were to getting into it. And one thing I looked at was, prohibition. If the government decided to shut down the alcohol industry, but they already tried that and it didn't work. So I thought, okay, that's one thing off the table. That's not a big risk.
Right.
I never thought about a pandemic that would shut down every restaurant,
never, right,
and bar for darn near 2 years in the West Coast. So, my trajectory of seeing, and maybe retirement down the line got definitely disrupted by COVID. We couldn't make a living for really 2 years, and I'm not sure we've fully recovered we haven't fully recovered on the West Coast. If you look at our company where we have fully recovered, it's in places like Florida or Tennessee, where they really didn't shut down the restaurant industry for nearly as long. So COVID was a huge factor, but that's just a historical fluke. You wouldn't expect that when you're planning on buying a franchise.
Right. Yeah. So does your concept do people hire teams, or do you have a team?
Yeah. In the early days, we went out and did inventories ourselves, but then you're very naive when you buy at least I was very naive when I bought a franchise, in that I was just thinking, I can make $130,000, which 30 years ago was great money. And I'll just do these inventories every day. And without really much thought, Charles, to what I was going to do once I hit capacity. So all of a sudden I can't add any more clients, and I start getting referrals. I'm like, now what am I going to do?
Right.
And I was a pretty bad business person. I ended up hiring a really good friend, and I just taught him to do what I do. And he went out and did his own inventories, and that worked great until he took another job. And all of a sudden now I had to do all mine and all his and hire somebody. And then we started to realize that, having part-time people or having teams out in the field is a more sustainable business model. But, and that's sort of the downside of buying a franchise that has no track record, is that they haven't thought that through yet. It was exciting to go through that in a good way and a bad way. But, you can afford to be excited and go through those tribulations if you don't have a mortgage.
Right. Exactly. So how many people do you have that work for you now? Do you have part-timers or?
Yeah. So we've sort of shifted our business model a little bit, at least in the territory I own. I don't live where my territory is. So we've shifted to a hybrid model where the client does the actual counting.
Okay.
At least in my territory, we've shifted to that. That's not true for our whole company. And so I don't have a team of people out there. I have a team of people work in an office helping the client, doing all the data entry and analysis. So I've got a couple of people, 3 people that work for me doing that.
Okay. So I guess if you could provide some advice for people who have never hired, or led a team, or, been able to delegate, I've even had problems delegating to my franchises, sometimes people feel like, they're just the best person to do stuff. Could you offer some advice on, how to lead a team and, and what some strategies that you've used?
Yeah. Well, I think you make a great point. Delegating is very, very difficult because you probably are the best person to do it. Yeah. At least you'll do it better than people you can hire in the short run. My philosophy, I sort of developed this over time, was that if you can systematize your business, you can start seeing, by the way, let me interrupt here. The E-Myth is a book that I read a long, long time ago. And it really changed my thinking on this, that if you can figure out what roles you do. So when you buy a business, you do all the roles. You're the accountant, you're the salesperson, you're the data analyst, you're all everything. In our business, you're the inventory taker. And if you can start thinking of those as different roles and figuring out where you add the most value and where anybody can do it. So in our business, really anybody can scan a bottle and count them.
Right.
And so that's a role that I can replace. And the person I hire can do it just as well as I can after, a month or two. So that makes it a little easier to delegate because you're still keeping the part where you're adding the most value. In our business, inventory taking is not very glamorous. You're climbing ladders, you're on your hands and knees looking in the back of a cooler with a flashlight. Sometimes you're low. For us, it was certainly important to have that potential hire come out to an inventory and see what they're getting into. What you don't want is hiring somebody, they do it for 2 weeks and quit, and now you've got to start all over again. You wasted 2 weeks training them. Once they're up and running, I think the best thing you can be is just a good person. I always tried to every now and again just show up and help them do the inventory, even though I was paying them to do it. And I still pay them for the whole time they were normally going to be there, even though they get to go home, an hour early. The other thing I learned early is that you're better off paying them, an acceptable wage, but maybe a little lower, and then giving them lots of raises in the early days, small raises, but so they can see that as they're getting better and putting the commitment in, that I'm going to be rewarding them for it. So, if minimum wage is $15, I might put an ad in for 16 or 17 because these days it's hard to find anybody. And then once they start, I'm quickly getting them up to like 21 within, say, 6 months without telling them I'm going to do it. That's sort of the key to it too.
Right. Yeah. Are there any other like retention strategies that, I feel like even whenever I had some of my businesses where we've had those jobs at $15, $16 an hour, it seems like, they'd leave you for 50 cents or another dollar somewhere else down the street. And, so you kind of had to feel as if you needed to do some things that were different, outside the box. Have you done anything outside the box, like other than giving periodical raises? Anything? You
make a great point though, Charles. If who can blame them for leaving for an extra buck, right? I mean, it's an entry level job is a low paying job. So if they can make more money somewhere else, I can't really blame them. So I think we want to be competitive on wages for sure, as much as we can, especially to the point where, they've got a skill set in this thing that you've helped them develop. And let's say they're making $21 an hour, but they don't really have any other great skill sets. So it's hard for them to go make $30 an hour somewhere.
Sure.
And then I think I've just always had the philosophy that I want to make them feel like they're part of my team, part of my family almost. So, I'll have them over for dinner to my house, which is a little weird, but I've generally become pretty good friends with almost every employee I've had. And then, if there's a job that pays $1 more, they probably won't leave for that.
Right.
Or if they're thinking of it, they'll come to me first instead of just giving me their notice. Of course, people are going to leave. I think you've got to get out of the thought process that an entry level position, they're going to stay for 10 years. They're probably not. Just a fact of life, really.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I always kind of like, I think I caught people off guard sometimes when I was going through the interview processes or even after hiring, I'm like, hey, I know that this isn't your last job, this isn't your last job forever. Right. Like, so how can we help you build some skills here that you can bring on to your next job, and it would just, whoa, what are you talking about? Like, oh, I'm going to be here for a long time, and, knowing that they'd be there for 6 months or 8 months, and
that's a good idea. I like it.
Yeah. But again, it's just like it, if we can help you build some skills here, what skills can we build, whether it's sales or whatever it might be. And, so I always try to take an approach that, we had their best interests, especially as you start to scale and get bigger. So, yeah.
And kind of building on that, in some franchise systems, there's an opportunity for advancement because there's lots of roles. In ours, those roles are limited, but there's a few. So you can say to them, hey, if you like this and you feel like you're good at it, this is the next role for you as we go along. I don't know when that will be. It depends on our growth. But in some franchise systems, there's all kinds of room for advancement.
Sure.
Would probably be helpful.
To kind of, take a step sideways here, you kind of recently have dived into Sandler. Is that the franchise Sandler, or did you just do some Sandler training?
Sandler training, but it was super interesting. I always thought I was a really good salesperson. And the first time I went to a Sandler boot camp, they said, okay, a lot of you guys are good salespeople, but are you good salespeople because you're technically good at sales? Like you're adept at working with people and getting them to come to a decision. Or are you good at sales because you actually do them and make some effort and you maybe got a little charisma, you can talk to people? And I'm like, oh yeah, maybe that's me. I just kind of wing it. And so Sandler really helped me understand the psychology behind selling, and I'm so much more effective now. Mainly, I think, because I don't try to sell people anymore. It's more trying to help them come to on a voyage of self-discovery, kind of where you ask the right questions and they either decide that we're a good fit or we're not. I think it's a way better approach, and it's made me a better salesperson.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Is there any sales or any Sandler technique that you like the most? I mean, is there one that you use a lot, or?
Yeah, I think there's two. They have a concept called an upfront contract, where at the beginning of every conversation you have with a prospect, you kind of lay out how long the discussion is going to be. You get their assent to ask them some questions, so they feel comfortable that you're asking them that contract. And it's very brief. You're explaining at the end of the. So, for example, the next step could be you might decide we're not a good fit, and that's perfectly fine. Or you might decide we might be a good fit, and the next step would be doing X. And so that there's none of this wishy-washy, let me think about it. That we've all agreed at the beginning on those things. So the upfront contract's really good. The one thing I've actually got on a sticky note pinned to below my computer here, it's the idea that people don't argue with their own data. So when as a salesperson, when you're telling somebody how great your service is and that they have, in our business, you're telling somebody they're probably losing money to overpouring, they tend to back away a little bit because you're trying to sell them something. But if you can ask them the right questions so that they say, yeah, I'm worried about overpouring, totally different dynamic. It's their data. They're not going to argue with it. And you don't seem like a pushy, always be closing salesperson. So those are two of my favorite techniques they have.
Right.
How about you? You know a lot about Sandler.
Yeah. Like I always have liked the, I'm trying to think of the way that he says it, but it's like kind of like the reverse, like the negative reverse, I think is what he calls it or something. Yeah. And so where is, you almost take it away from somebody, like take, or like, the upfront contract's great, but also take the decision away from them and just say, this isn't a good fit. Like we aren't going to be good for you, and just take that pressure away of like the no's already out there. The no's already been said, like, let's just go ahead and say like, hey, we're not a good fit, like, let's just go ahead and get that on the table. And then, just really go the opposite direction where they think that you're going to go. They think that Ian's going to come in here and try to sell me this, this stuff that's going to save me all this money. And, you might go in and say, hey, there's a possibility I might not save you any money today, and they're like, whoa, really? Then what are you here for? And then just completely like change their mind of the direction they think that you might be going, and, it's so they kind of just like, it takes their mind in a different direction. So that way it kind of leaves the door open for you to some trust, for you to really, talk to them about, what you really are there to talk to them about. And a lot of times that is just to get to know them, understand their business. And the fact may be you might not be able to save them money. Right. And, even though that you probably will, but, there's some things where I think people just don't want to feel like they're being sold, or the snake oil salesman. They just want to have a real conversation. And so if you can kind of take away the hey, are you going to sign today? Get that out of their mind. And I think that they feel good about it.
I love that, Charles. You're exactly right. And the key is not to do it as a manipulative way to like do a reverse psychology. The key is to be very genuine about it. We might not be a good fit. People can tell when they're being manipulated, I think, as opposed to a genuine, we might not be a good fit. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And, and the same thing kind of goes with like franchising. Whenever I'm helping people find a franchise, I'm like, there's, a franchise is not made for everybody. Business ownership is not made for everybody. Like, there are worker bees out there, and like we need the worker bees too, and they make good money. And then we got people who are really good at running businesses, and then we have people that are really good at following the system but leading the team. And so sometimes, like we don't know if it's going to be a good fit, but like I try to tell that to people whenever I'm first helping them, like, hey, like a lot of times people are like, will I be a good franchisee? Like, will I be successful? I have no idea. I don't have a crystal ball, but, we got to take a look, and then it's going to be a decision-making process over time. It may not be a good fit. And I think like if I can get people there and like help them understand, like whether you're going to look at something like a sculpture, hospitality, or restoration franchise, like you got to have an open mind and try to, can I succeed in this business? Or am I more, do I feel more comfortable as a W-2 worker? And both are fine, and if I tell that to people, like, hey, like it's okay to say no. There could be a no at the end of this, and that's okay. It seems to ease their mind.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. Yeah.
Well, to kind of just, again, thanks, Ian, for jumping on. To kind of just like wrap this up, if somebody's looking at sculpture and like, they want to do that, or they're just looking at franchising or even getting a business for themselves, like, what kind of advice would you give somebody, if you could kind of go back and talk to Ian again, 30 years ago, like what kind of advice would you give somebody, getting into franchising or opening their own business?
Boy, I could talk for an hour about that. I'll keep it brief. I think making sure the franchisor has a proven system. I think it's super important to talk to as many franchisees as they have and ask them some really intelligent questions. For example, if they're complaining about the franchise, you want to understand what the root cause of that is. Is it because maybe it was a bad fit and they shouldn't have bought this business? Is it because the franchisor is not treating them fairly? Or is it because they're not putting in the work? And so you can ask them, like if you're looking at our business and someone's saying, well, I'm not doing that well, you can ask them how much time they spend prospecting. And you generally find they don't spend any time prospecting if they're failing. Right. So those are good questions. I think really understanding the franchise agreement is a huge issue that a lot of people, they read it, they don't think about it very deeply. Maybe getting a lawyer is a good idea to read the franchise agreement. I think that's really important. And sometimes you don't know this until you take the leap. But if you can really look in the mirror and think about the stress that's going to happen at the beginning and really honestly decide, am I going to be able to handle that? I've seen really strong franchisees who, in the early days of their business, fail. And one of the key factors, which is interesting, is almost anybody can take one big setback and rebound from it. But if they have two big setbacks sort of back to back, some people just kind of mentally collapse and are looking for the exit. And
sure.
So you've got to have that, stick-to-itiveness. In the long run, I love having my own business. When my kids were little, I could walk them to school every day. So, they come home from school and I have a home-based business. So I was here. That part I really like. But the one thing you don't think about when you have a regular job, when you come home and it's the weekend, you're not thinking about your job very often, although that's changed lately with, you're always available for emails. But
sure.
If you have your own business, it's you're thinking about it all the time. So I think the advice I give people is really look at that, think about the stress and the fact that you can't really just turn it off and decide whether you'd be energized by that or if that will just be crushing to you. And there's people on both sides of that, as you said a minute ago. So those are my top few things.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. I always tell people as they start to dive into the, talk to franchisees, I'm like, hey, just, be wary. Like you may talk to people who are very unhappy with the brand, but they're making hundreds of thousands a year, and then you're going to talk to people who absolutely love the brand and they're not making any money, so, like you got to be able to read between the lines a little bit and ask the right questions. So it's really good advice.
That's a great point. And that's true. I think that there are people making tons of money, very successful business that just like to complain, I guess, because they, everything could always be better. The company could always spend more money on things and, nobody's perfect.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and it depends on the day that you catch them too, somebody, they could have just lost their dog or something, but
that's true.
Well, Ian, thanks again for joining us, man. It was very nice to meet you. I appreciate you joining us here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.